Good afternoon, everybody. Excuse me hobbling, but we collect evidence for evaluations in many different ways. And I was in the Solomon Islands about 8 weeks ago with the World Bank Commission, looking at expanding a new project into new islands. So my job was to go and look at the environmental and social safeguards. And they said, well, we really need support because these areas are really dangerous. And so I said, show me. And they did. And hence I'm bringing with me the evidence of unsafe places. So I usually prefer to stand up and wander around, but I may have to sit down occasionally if I start to wobble. So excuse me for that. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about, you can't really see that, can you? Shall we put some of the lights off? At least up here. There you go. Is that a bit better? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so sustainable development. We're going to talk about the fact that very often it's a balancing act, that there are different priorities and we need to work on those priorities. We're going to look at people and complexity. Because at the end of the day, how do you get that balancing act happening? A lot of it is around the decisions that people make. So we're going to stop for a minute and look at people and what happens there. Then, obviously, we have to look at complexity, because complexity of bringing multidisciplinary processes together, bringing multi-stakeholders together in uncertain circumstances, all brings a level of complexity that somehow we have to deal with. Then I'm going to give you a couple of examples from actually my PhD research. So I've actually been really grateful for this chance to dust off some of my research and bring it back into thinking, because so much of what I've been doing in the last few years has been about doing rather than thinking. So it's good to go back and sometimes reflect on previous work that you've done. Then we're going to look at decision-making theory and how that actually links into complexity in sustainable development, and how there's a lot of theory around about decision-making, both in individual and group situations, but how do we apply that into sustainable development situations? And then finally, bringing all that together, what does that mean? How do we take that forward? How do we measure what's happening in sustainable development? Now, as an evaluator, up front, you always have to put your biases on the table. So I'm going to put my bias on the table. We're talking about sustainable development and is it measurable? So I have to put my bias on the table and say, I believe it is. We may not be very good at it. We may need to improve it. But I believe that we have a fundamental set of tools that we can use to measure whether we are proceeding forward with sustainable development or not. So I declare that interest up front, but I'm hoping we'll have some time to discuss that, and feel free to challenge it and make me think further about it. So, I'm assuming, first of all, from a sustainability point of view, that you're all very familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. Is that a correct assumption? Okay. All right. I've been doing a lot of work around the Sustainable Development Goals, followed on from the Millennium Development Goals. Major evaluation of the Millennium Development Goals says one of the weaknesses was that there weren't enough measurements happening. So what's actually happened with the Sustainable Development Goals, partly there's been a massive stakeholder engagement in that process, different from the MDGs. There's also been a big push towards engaging governments, statisticians, all forms of people who actually look at science, technology, measurements into developing a series of indicators and targets for the SDGs. I was in Manila about 3 weeks ago at a statisticians conference. I'm not quite sure what you call a collective of statisticians. Was it a bunch of statisticians or and they were very intently looking at the measurements for the Sustainable Development Goals. So you had National Statistics Office, you had scientists, you had a whole range of people within there. Now, if you're not aware, please go and find out a bit more, because there's a lot happening in the space of the SDGs. It's important because the 17 SDGs are not designed to be considered as number 1 to number 17. A lot of it is actually about the interrelationship between the SDGs and how they balance between themselves. So the SDGs actually help us to look at how we weigh the balance between those different priorities that have been identified through stakeholder processes for sustainable development. Within those indicators, they are not all currently available with measurements. So roughly about 1/3 are already being measured. They're already there in the majority of countries, basic population figures, poverty levels, etc., etc. They're developed on standard measurements, which are within the statistics community. There's about another third, roughly, you can tell I'm not a statistician, I don't do exact numbers, where there are some measurements. So some countries measure some of it, some countries measure some others. But there is movement towards standardizing methodologies, and there's a lot of focus on this at the moment. There's roughly about another third of indicators where there are currently no measurements across the board globally. There may be snippets here and there in different countries. A lot of these are qualitative indicators. So, for instance, one of the things that the MDGs came up with was that you can build schools, you can actually get teachers into those schools, but are the children learning anything? So there's a whole range of new measurements which have come in which are much more outcome related. One of the things with the MDGs is they were very output orientated. Have you got the schools? Have you got the teachers? But not, are you actually achieving the changes that you want to? There has been a lot more work done on that since, and as I say, we're moving forward on that. So this is one area where there's a whole range of measurements going on. But one of the discussions we've been having with statisticians is measurement is one thing, but how do you use those measurements for future change? So aren't measurements just a way of telling us where we're up to? It's a status report. So each country is eventually supposed to produce a voluntary national review for sustainable development. There's been 66 that have been provided so far. In those, there's been a huge focus on statistics around the SDGs, but very little on how are we using that information to drive forward sustainable development. So this is an area where I believe that we can really make some headway. So how do we do that? So for the SDGs, they talk about the 5 Ps. So people, prosperity, and planet, we are fairly familiar with. But with the SDGs, they add 2 more Ps, which is peace and partnerships. And interestingly, I do a fair amount of training on sustainable development, and this has become a very easy way across different cultures to explain sustainable development. Because the planet is the base. It's what you stand on. The spindle is actually, if these things break, partnership or peace, if there's no peace, if there are no partnerships, you can't get the balance right between prosperity and people, so the economics and the social. So where's the actual spindle on which that all works? It's actually the decision making, because who makes the decision to go to war? Who makes the decision to retain a protected wetland? Who makes the decision to stick a highway in a fragile environment? So wherever those decisions are made, that's where we get a nexus of potential, either disaster or advance for sustainable development. So let's narrow in on the actual nexus of decision making. First of all, it's about people. So people, let's have a look within this room. We might say that we're all stakeholders in the sustainable development process. If you do any kind of process, usually you do a stakeholder mapping. So let's just have a straw poll. How many of you are more, would you say, in the environmental sphere? Okay, actually probably more than half. Social? There we go. Economic. Lone voice in the wilderness sometimes. Or how many would say that you are squarely in the multidimensional mixed aspect of sustainable development? Not quite sure where you are. So you see that when you come into a process, already people are coming with a certain mindset. So actually acknowledging that as part of the stakeholder processes is very important, to actually understand different perspectives and where people are coming from. How many of you are here today as individual, in your own right, just coming because you wanted to come? Right? How many of you are here because you're representatives in an organisation and you want to go back to your organisation? 2 organisations. Okay. So again, you find that people come in with different perspectives. If I come in, if I'm on a job for the World Bank, I might come in with a completely different headset than if I come to a situation as partner with a civil society organisation. So when you get a multi-stakeholder process within sustainable development, already you have a situation of complexity, because the individuals sitting in the room are coming with a certain number of complexities in their own right. Who are they on this particular day? Who are they in this particular process? What have they got behind them? Who do they have to report back to? So that's a really important thing. And then coming into a process, we also come with expectations. So those expectations, you might come in saying you want to learn something and take that away. But you might come in and say, well, actually, I wanted somewhere quiet to eat my lunch. So it's a matter of what you expect to get out of a process. Again, bringing that into a mix can affect decision making. So that's why there's a lot of talk these days about stakeholder mapping. And again, it's a matter of, well, who's here, who's in the room? But it needs to go much further than that. Who's in the room and what are they bringing with them? Who's in there and what are those influences on them that will actually affect, when it comes to the crunch point of decision making, what's actually going to happen there? So those are questions. I'm not going to answer them at the moment, but I'll give you some examples shortly. So complexity, I'm pretty sure you're all fairly familiar with complexity, that we are not looking at particularly the picture on the left. What we want to do is to bring it into some form of order and understanding. So there's a whole range, and we haven't got time to do a thesis on complexity theory at the moment. But one of the key things it talks about is bounded rationality. So within complexity, what are the boundaries that you are looking at that particular time? How do you bring that into a landscape that you can actually look at and say, let's have a look at all the different elements, the tangled web here, and say, what can we actually see within that, within a specific particular area of focus? I'm not sure if, have any of you heard of the Canopy framework? No? Okay, that's a subject for another day, but it's worth looking at. What it looks at is, how do you actually make sense out of complexity? You have the areas, think about a quadrant. You have the area that is simple, you have area that's complicated. It's just that there's a lot of it, and you just have to tease out what's there. But once you've sorted it out, it's actually quite easy to deal with. You just have to put effort in there. Then you have a whole area of complexity where it's difficult to probe what the influences are. And that's the area we're really talking about. Because with stakeholders, it's really difficult to probe what are they doing, why are they there, what are they here for, what do they hope to get out of a particular process. The fourth quadrant is chaos. And we're not going there, we don't particularly want it, but we need to know it's there. And one of my mottos of life in sustainable development is that the peak of progress is actually on the edge of chaos. Because if you get round the simple, the complicated, and into the complex, and you're getting close towards the chaotic, it means that you're really pushing forward on that complexity boundary. So we want to, within complexity, look at what we do know and look at what we don't know and probe into that. So we can do that with a whole range of measurements, but we need to pay attention to it and actually focus in on our particular area. So moving into the bit of research that I did. From the top, you'll see the three circles of sustainable development. We can argue about whether there's 4, whether there's 5 now with the Sustainable Development Goals. But at the time, to make it fairly straightforward, looking at the social, economic and environmental aspect, and that the ideal outcome that we would be looking for in a sustainable development environment is to see some form of balance between those that allowed harmony between the environmental protection aspects, social well-being and prosperity. Sometimes we have no connection between those, and so part of our dynamic is actually to build connections between those different sectors. What I did was looked at areas where there was already some connection but it wasn't working very well. So on the left-hand side we have a situation where there's imbalance. So either we can have a situation by the end of whatever the intervention is where we get an improved balance, we get a shift. Do we have a completely unsustainable process where there's no change at all, and God forbid it gets worse? So what I tried to look at is a series of situations to say, here's the beginning of a process where there was a problem identified. What do we have at the end of that process, which was actually under the banner of here's something that people are calling a sustainable development process? Was there actually a shift? And if so, what were the dimensions that created that shift? So that was the question that I was trying to ask. Okay so far? Yeah? Okay, so what we actually got was a bit of a mess. That people found it very difficult to sort out exactly what was happening. So I went into it in a lot more detail to say, okay, here's the situation. Let's probe into that and let's see what we can get out of that situation. So I went to 60 different situations, 30 within the Peel region of Western Australia, and 30 within the Philippines. I had the privilege at the time of working in both, in fragile environments, and you may say they don't look very similar, but I'll show you some photographs in a minute. So the Peel region in Western Australia, there's a Ramsar listed wetland in there. There's huge population pressures. Same within the area that's circled there. It's an area that's very high in tourism in central Philippines. Lots of pressures in there. So 30 complex situations in each one that came under the banner of sustainable development strategies, or leaders who have talked about it as a situation where they wanted to achieve more sustainable outcomes. So we had predominantly environmental ones. So if you think of those 3 circles with fairly uneven circles at the beginning, so characterizing them predominantly environment, predominantly social, predominantly economic, or mixed. So the environmental ones: river degradation, polluted estuary; social, poverty, health hazards, indigenous determination; economic, new infrastructure, mining development; and the mixed ones usually where there was some form of mixed land use planning. So the research question was, what are the determinants of successful or failed attempts in sustainable development? So working with stakeholders to get that perspective. I spoke to 259 respondents over the period of about 5 years. And those covered social scientists, local government people, government, technical experts, etc. They covered a wide range of institutions, so academe, government, businesses, looked at secondary technical data to see whether some of the processes were actually robust from a technical point of view, and made some physical observations as well, because often that tells us a lot. So, observations, you can observe for yourself that these are 2 completely different countries, different situations, but can you start to see some patterns emerging? Left is the Peel-Harvey estuary system, right is Olango Island in Cebu. See some similarities there? And when you get into the technical side of it, you also had a lot of similarities. In fact, I was surprised by the level of similarities. You had black ooze, you had algae, blue-green algae blooms, etc. You have fish kills. You had all sorts of things happening in both locations. But you also had the effects of land clearing. So land clearing for mining in the Peel region, landslide due to logging, excessive logging within the central Philippines. And that had impact on river systems, also on coastal environments, also on people. And I'll give you some examples about how these economic examples actually had quite far-reaching impacts as well. Both areas, tourism focus, with that increasing settlements around fragile environments. So both locations were facing the same problems and asking, interestingly enough, very similar questions and bringing together very similar groups of stakeholders: land use planners, tourism people, environmental groups, etc. So it was really interesting to look at the parallels between the 2 locations. With people comes infrastructure. So how do you actually build infrastructure in fragile environments that will benefit people and commerce, but not impact severely on the environment? The Peel-Harvey estuary, this Dorothy channel, is actually a man-made channel, and has had very far-reaching environmental impacts. And people say now, that was one of the failed examples I did, that if they had gone down a different pathway, that they would never have done that because of the environmental impacts had such far-reaching effects. If you have increasing numbers of people, you also have need for utilities, so public water supply. How do you provide enough water for growing industries, for drinking water, etc.? So can you see the similarities between the two locations that at first glance may seem very different, but actually there were a lot of similarities. So I haven't got time to go into the findings in great detail, but here's just some snippets of what was coming out of it. The unsuccessful processes, and I've called those incomplete stridency. They were processes where people were very strident in them. This is my position and I'm sticking to it. Or, well, we need some piece of information, but we haven't got time to get it, so we're just going to go on anywhere. So there was a lot of that in the failed examples. There was no grounds or process for negotiation. So although there were decisions made, there was no recognized process for negotiation. So they might have had consultation processes, community consultation, but that community consultation didn't go anywhere. There wasn't a mechanism to get the community consultation into the decision-making process. Or the process was unrepresentative. So a lot of the feedback was, well, this happened and we were never even included. And we should have been, and now look at it. So those were some of the characteristics of the unsuccessful processes. But what about the successful processes? We need to learn from those. And I've sort of called those conflict, cooperation, and co-solutions. Because it wasn't that there wasn't conflict. It wasn't all lovey-dovey right from the word go. In fact, it wasn't lovey-dovey even at the end. But what happened was that the conflict was acknowledged and it was listened to. That led to a form of cooperation. And I'll go into the cooperation aspects in a bit more detail. What does that really mean? It doesn't just mean cooperation, we're going to sit down and cooperate, but there were real steps involved in that, and that's a real key factor. And then there was working towards co-solutions. So what were some of the other characteristics of that process? One, there was a simultaneous presence of a distinct issue, so the boundary, and distinct opportunity. So it wasn't people sitting around in a room saying, oh my goodness, we've got a problem. There was already some form of opportunity on the table. It may not have been the opportunity that they ended up with, but there was an opportunity opened up that allowed discussion to occur. So what that did was it focused attention on the fact that there may well be a solution, and therefore there was a discussion around a potential path forward. Often there have been unsuccessful processes in the past. There were a lot of people saying, oh, we've sat down and done this before and it didn't work, so what's different this time? That's familiar to some of you. There were people saying, well, look at that example over there, that didn't work, so why is that going to be different? Because we're going to learn from it. So the unsuccessful examples actually provided a springboard for more successful aspects. Also gave a willingness for people to negotiate, because if they realized that they didn't get anywhere last time with a particular line of reasoning, they probably weren't going to get anywhere this time. So they had to change their own behavior. Very often there was an understanding of the complexity. Now that might not have been at the beginning of the process, but very soon after the beginning of the process, people had to open their eyes. So there was a lot of discussion where people say, oh, you know what, I never even realized that Indigenous people had environmental systems, or a social person. You know, I've never met business people like that before. They're really nice. So very understanding different points of view. So the process actually had to build those kind of windows for learning across different disciplines, across different people. That opened the opportunity for access to more technical information. So in the past, technical information in the failed examples tend to be delivered. Here's a 200-page report, go away and read that and come back. But in the successful examples, there was the willingness to learn first, then it was, well, what would you like to know about? And then bringing in that level of technical information. Okay, now you know about that, what do you need to know about next? So it was a technical learning process. Then there was an active and functional multi-stakeholder negotiation process, not consultation. I want to make that distinction quite clear. Consultation processes are not necessarily negotiation processes. So who is involved in the decision making around resource allocations and solutions? That is different from being consulted about. Negotiation actually brings people into the decision making table. And then there was the last one, which actually came out as an interesting point, was good facilitative leadership. Not talking necessarily about chairmanship, but interestingly across all of the different stakeholders, whether it be business, government, whatever, pointed to a success factor being somebody within the room who facilitated decision making and facilitated the decision making process. And I say not necessarily the chair, but who said things like, hang on, we haven't heard from everybody yet. So that kind of leadership who understood the multidimensional aspects of the decisions to be made was very important in the process. A little bit of a complicated slide, and I'm saying complicated, not complex. But I'm putting this in because one of the questions that came through was about uncertainty. I'm not sure if the person who asked that question is in the room. But it's a very, very good question because a lot of the people through the process talked about uncertainty. And complexity and uncertainty tend to go hand in hand. And it's one of the biggest things that people naysay about sustainable development. Oh, there's too many uncertainties, how can you deal with that? But actually the successful examples dealt with that through the decision-making process. So if you look at multiple factors in your decision-making of your particular process, you have uncertainty in there. That gives you complex decision to be made. You have to consider different aspects. So there are a whole range of technical and temporal input that's required. So what do we need to know and in what time frame do we need to know it? So those kind of decision-making aspects are right up front. That's not making a decision about the final outcome. That's making a decision about the process. And that had a big impact on whether a process was actually successful or not. So the decisions around what do we need to know, when do we need to know it, where do we get the information from, when have we got enough information to make a decision, and called that the crux of the decision point. When do we say enough is enough, and then we make a decision? Because some people say analysis paralysis, and you don't even get to the point of decision making. So this is about moving through the uncertainty to get to the point where we say we are certain enough now to make a decision. So looking at the multiple attributes, scenario planning was present in a lot of the successful examples. What if we do this? What if we do that? What are the technical implications of this? What are the environmental aspects of that? What are the social impacts? So that kind of scenario planning, strategic planning, modelling measurements was really important to the eventual measurement of the success. So then looking at the stages of process. So can we do a pilot? Can we do this bit first, then see how it goes, then do that bit? So uncertainty was put into different boundaries. How can we make this into a focused point where we can deal with uncertainty to the point where we make sure we're not doing any harm and we're shifting to that more sustainable outcome? Then we can do the next bit. So that leads down then to direct choice with certainty equivalence. This is actually work from Holloway, by the way, adapted. So this is all, there's a lot of uncertainty information around the 1980s, decision-making theory, uncertainty theories. Very interesting stuff if you have a spare weekend, you want to have a look at it. What we're now, of course, doing in evaluation is moving more forward towards those outcome-focused measurements. So, although that wasn't so strong in a lot of these examples at the beginning, by the time they got through their phased process, they were much clearer about the outcomes that they wanted to achieve. So there was an emerging process of acknowledging different outcomes which may not have been immediately obvious at the start. And important is on the trade-off as well. There's a fair bit being done at the moment on can you really get sustainable outcomes, or are there trade-offs where you, within your boundary, you might have to compromise a little, but you can trade off somewhere else. That's a whole other discussion as well. How am I doing for time, Ben?
We're 25 minutes.
Okay, I've got about another 5 or 10 minute discussion. Okay, so going back to decision making as the pivot point in sustainable development, let's focus in and hone in on that a little bit more. So Payne and Colton, in their work on group decision making, and we're talking here about a multi-stakeholder process in sustainable development, so we're effectively talking a group of people. I'll come to that in a minute. But they say you can't reach a group decision unless you've reached an individual decision. And that's a really important point, because if you don't get decision at the individual level, how do you get decision making at the group level? Otherwise, people sit back and say, I'm not going to be bothered because somebody else is going to make the decision. But if you're really balancing the decision making, you actually need to bring everybody to a decision making point. So respondents tend to talk about collaboration as an initial discrete step in the multi-stakeholder process. Individuals have to, first of all, decide to join in that process or not to join. So that in itself is an important decision. What is their motivation? What was that decision? Why did they come into the room? But then there was a deepening course of decision making through the process. It wasn't simple. It wasn't, I've decided to join this group and then we made a decision. There's actually a decision making process. They didn't reach it immediately. They had to keep going. They were exhausted by all the talking, all the technical detail. They had to learn so much. But it was a consistent finding across the stakeholder groups in both locations that the process itself was evidence that the decision-making process was ongoing towards a sustainable development goal because it was pivoting. So one time it might have been this, all those greenies, they keep speaking up in the meeting and they won't be quiet. Yes, because they've got something to say. So let's just listen to them and hear what that point is and maybe find out some more information. One of the really interesting examples from this was between a mining company and a community. And the community had settled itself right in the middle of, inconveniently of course, where the mining company wanted to go. So they started a process of discussion, and it was very uncomfortable. And there were lots of placards and all sorts of things going on there. But to cut a very long story short, what happened in the end was the mining company listened to what the community said, and they said, one of the things we find really important is we love the black cockatoos. And the red-tailed black cockatoos are an endangered species. And we are one of the few places that actually has them in our community, living and coming down into our gardens. We want that to continue. You're going to cut down all the trees that they live in. So Alcoa said, don't be silly. Did I say that? Sorry. The company said, we're going to cut down all the trees. So there was an agreement to bring in some bird specialists. So the bird specialists came in and found out information that neither the community nor the mining company knew, which was the birds actually sleep in one tree and feed in another tree. So you could preserve the nesting trees, but cut down the feeding trees and kill them all. Or you could preserve the feeding trees and cut down the nesting trees and kill them all. So you actually had to do both. So what they started to do was to map the feeding and the nesting trees. And what they found was there was one area in particular which had something like, I can't remember the exact amount, but something like 40% of the population in one location, which was in the mining envelope. So the community and the mining company worked together with the Environmental Protection Agency to protect that small locality. And in doing that, they achieved both of the objectives. So it's a great example of where there can be conflict at the beginning, but with that ongoing process of discussion and negotiation, you can actually find out something, add the technical knowledge, stir it all together, and come out with something really worthwhile. Has anybody seen this before, the power of coal? For those of you who are in the evaluation field, this is a really interesting example that was done. It's called the Twyford model, and it's based in New Zealand. And what they did was they wanted to do something with natural resource management and bring in a multi-stakeholder process. So a very similar process to what I've been telling you about my research. They have been looking at how do you evaluate those kind of things. I was doing it from a study perspective to learn, but they took some of the information and they're now doing it to design process evaluations. So I'm a great fan of process evaluations. I think there's a lot more we can do in that environment. So what they did was, out of their process, they developed this model of negotiation, if you like. So the dilemma is there. There's the commitment to collaborate. Then you co-define the dilemma. So there's a difference between the dilemma and co-defining the dilemma. Take note of that. Then you can co-design the process. You need to design the negotiation process before you start the negotiation. Otherwise, people get disenfranchised and left out. But if you define the process and you enable that process to unfold and you evaluate the process as to whether it's working, you can actually speed up the process towards more balanced outcomes. Once you've got the process, you can co-design the solution, like the red-tailed black cockatoos. Then you can co-deliver on the actions, which is what happened again with that example. And that actually brings you to a solution. That is measurable. So you can actually see that process emerging. I was looking at it with the benefit of hindsight, going back and saying, what do you remember about this process? And then I was able to share in some ongoing processes. But I haven't actually engaged in a process like this at this stage that evaluates a whole process like this in sustainable development. I've done it in different sectoral processes and it's working really well. They've done it in this multi-stakeholder process. And so what you can actually do is, at those checkpoints on the way up, you can see if that process is on track or not on track, and then adjust. So this is a very important learning for evaluation, that what they had in this process is they had a process evaluator who came in to quarterly meetings, I think, and they sat down and said, how's this process going? And they would talk to people and say, are you feeling included? Have you, where are you at in the negotiation? Are you feeling that you want to back out, or are you keeping going? So actually, keeping people in the process is really important to achieving the outcome. Otherwise, you run the risk of losing the impetus and it becoming a failed process. So then, another finding was something that I've called a Canopy organisation. And this was a distinctive feature of some of the processes, that under the, in the non-coloured arches there, you had people like the government agencies, and you had representatives of government agencies. So in here, so you had collective groups in multi-stakeholder processes. You've got, the government agencies, then you might have a couple of private sector companies, you might have individuals in there, you might have a consortium of community groups who are sort of representative of a region. But in a sustainable development process, you have this overarching organisation, but nobody tends to call it an organisation. It's a process. It's people coming together to talk about a particular programme. Very often, those collectives of people, they were present within the most successful sustainable development processes, and those groups tended to become more and more cohesive over time. Often they were unregistered, or even didn't have a name. Oh, we're going to have a meeting about the new bridge, but it wasn't called the bridge group. It was just a meeting. But because they were in a process, that multi-stakeholder process group started to form its own identity. And as it became more cohesive, it actually operated like an organisation. So if you go back into organisational development theory, you can actually see the characteristics occurring there. That means we can use some tools and measurement from organisational development theory to see if that process is being successful or not. So other characteristics they had were they had different sectoral representations. The ones who didn't effectively bring in all the different sectors didn't work as well. They often included technical people. Quite often people who were brought in for one session and got absorbed into the process because it was really interesting. Again, I go back to the red-tailed black cockatoo example, where the specialists that came in got so interested that they actually spent more time and got a grant to look at this work. And then this, what I'm calling a Canopy organisation, because it's not an umbrella organisation, it sits above that, actually became a really important stakeholder group for decision making. So even if the decision making power was held, for instance, with the Department of Lands, but because you had that group, the Department of Lands wouldn't be able to make a decision unless that group said they could. So there were ersatz organisations formed within these successful examples, which you can then actually use organisational development aspects to count and to measure whether they're working effectively. There were also steps within the process. Again, that's not terribly clear, but put those into 4 stages, essential stages for making things work. Engagement of the stakeholders, stage 1. Stage 2, interaction. How is the interaction happening? Is the interaction systematic? Is it building cohesion and structure? Is it building knowledge? Are they reaching a balanced decision? So what is the actual decision-making process? Is there competence within decision-making? And organisational development, you can measure competence. Negotiation, you can measure negotiation, you can look at minutes, you can look at who says what. Influence and leadership. Is there evidence that there is undue influence in the process? Quite often. So how do you deal with that? You can measure that. And then the outcomes, you can measure whether decisions have been made or not made. Very often failed solutions, disbanded, and no decision was ever reached. Therefore, you had a bad situation continue. And then you can measure with all our tools about and our summative evaluations, we can look at whether outcomes are reached. So, finally, organizational development theory says that there are things that you can measure. You can measure the process, you can use a theory of change to say, what do we expect to happen? And then you can measure whether it does or not. You have KPIs. You can measure whether outcomes are achieved or not. You can measure the survival and the functionality of the stakeholder process through the power of coal model. You can measure the efficiency of the process. You can look at the stages and the timing. Is it actually working in line with the process that it was doing? And you can measure the commitment and the level of agreement that is there in the process. So you can actually measure so many things throughout a process that then helps you to see whether you're actually achieving better balance and working towards more sustainable outcomes. So overall, the big brief, sustainable development, technical measurements, there's lots of them out there. It's a matter of which ones do you apply within a bounded rationality, within a complex situation. Very often there's KPIs, there's indicators, there's SDGs, there's targets, you can measure towards those. But there's also process measurements that we can use. And we can look at organizational structures and systems, and we can look at effectiveness and efficiency in decision making. So actually we've got a lot more tools in the toolbox for measuring sustainable development than we might actually think. But if we focus only on the outcomes, i.e. when the flowers bloom, are we actually looking to see if the trees are growing, whether they're well rooted? Are we looking at the nutrients that are being drawn from the soil? So within our sustainable development processes, we can actually apply a lot more measurements than we're already doing. And we need to do it during the process, not just after the fact. That allows us to see whether we're actually creating links and progress towards that overall canopy, if you like, of the forest, complex forest of sustainable development. Thank you very much. Questions?
Thanks, Dorothy. I had a question, but I'm Kevin Birchall, I'm a colleague of Ben's at Policy Studies Institute, and I had a question that relates to the slide that I think you had study findings, and it was about the characteristics of successful and unsuccessful sustainable development projects. And I was wondering who decided that they were successful or unsuccessful, and on what grounds. So, were you talking about successful processes? Were you talking about successful outcomes out there? Or
how did that work? Yeah. Very good question, and it's as with many things, it's a multidimensional answer. That when I started, I actually looked at situations where people were already saying, I did it in 2 phases, so I did an initial scan, if you like, with a group of stakeholders to say what would you consider would be good examples of failed and which would be good examples of successful ones, and for what reason. So it might be where there was, people identified that there was a big imbalance between the economic benefits and the environmental outcomes, or a good environmental outcome but a poor economic outcome. So it was where people identified that there was an imbalance was one aspect. Then the other one was where I saw that organizations were working on a sustainability strategy. So under that sustainability strategy, what were they saying would be sort of good examples of sustainability, a good sustainability process. So I brought those together within those 30 examples from the two study sites.
So am I right? Sorry, to summarise, did you decide what was successful processes?
Eventually, yes.
Yeah.
Based on all the both technical information and feedback from the stakeholders.
Okay. And I suppose I was slightly concerned about it because it's quite a binary thing, isn't it? I mean, one might imagine that things would be successful in some ways, but not so much in others. So I was just a bit worried about that kind of complexity.
Which is why that slide was
there.
That it wasn't simple. So then it was a matter of honing down on what did people define as, what did people characterize within a successful process. So sometimes, for instance, an example might have swung between the unsuccessful and saying, well, hang on, now they're talking about some really good outcomes that come out of that. Or a couple of examples where they were previously unsuccessful, but then the process sort of petered on for a bit and then got new life, and then became more successful. So you're right, the binary aspect of it was a learning tool for the process.
So the UK government guidance on evaluation is called the Magenta Book. That's being revised and put out again in 2018. There's going to be apparently more of a focus on realist methods, so what works for whom in what circumstances.
Yes.
Also, interestingly, they're going to have a load of stuff on how you should engage with stakeholders more and involve them throughout the process and have a successful ongoing process of engaging them in your evaluation. What would be 1, 2, 3 key things you'd want to see in guidance like that from the government about how to make successful processes happen? Because it's not, it's complex. It's not easy.
Yeah, which is why the 4 at the end. So those 4. When we talk about engagement of stakeholders, what do we really mean? Do we mean consultation, or do we really mean engagement? So, not just saying, right, we're going to open this process up for engagement. Somebody send in a submission to a process, and you will become one of 700 who respond to this. And so, what is the actual issue that is being dealt with? So you might need to, for instance, have 3 different engagement processes because they're different issues. And so if you have the boundaries are too wide, then people can't engage with it. So actually making sure that people can engage with a specific issue, which is important and where they have a stake. Otherwise, they're a stakeholder in the canopy, but you're not dealing with the tree in their forest. So those sorts of things are important. The realization of complexity in that so many people just say, right, let's do a stakeholder map, here's our list, but some of them may not want to be involved all the way. They may just want to be involved and be heard at the beginning. So the stakeholder mapping also needs to reflect the complexity of the situation. The commitment, what are people saying when they're stakeholders? Are they committing time and resources, or are they not? The lead organisation is very important, because if you don't have a lead organisation that's open to stakeholders, which I hope none of you aren't planning, but very often planners do not really want to engage because it's messy. So the lead organisation in the process needs to be committed to that engagement process. And then I've talked pretty much about the interactions and how the actual balance decision making and a focus on outcomes. So those would be the 4 things.
My name is Canopy and I'm a researcher at the School of Hygiene and I'm researching food systems, in particular this nexus point of environmental sustainability, diets, and price health and nutrition impacts for people. And I'm just wondering what your experience, if any, has been with stakeholders who ostensibly commit to these collective KPIs, as you say. So, for example, let's say reduction of child obesity, but then in reality this commitment is perhaps less in the case of, say, commercial interest, specific commercial interest, than it is to feel they're protecting their profits, essentially. And so they join a process and say that they're committed, and yet there's a bit of subversion of that process as such to protect their profits. So I'm just wondering if you've encountered that and what sorts of solutions that you have to try and engage all these stakeholders in something that actually works to achieve those things. And you have these strong critical interests in.
Yeah. So that comes into, yes, is the short answer to your question, or have I encountered it? Yes. And of course, that was the first point about who's in the room and why are they there. So what do they want to get out of it? So maybe they're protecting the profits, but maybe also they didn't get out of it something that they went in there hoping to get. So an example would be a large project in Africa that I was working on with food security. And it was a value chain development process. So they wanted to engage with the private sector. But then they had a sort of 18-month period where they expected companies to dedicate their CEO's time once a month for 3 hours to the process, which they did for the first 6 months or so, but then saying, I'm just sitting around the table talking about this is not working for me. So they backed out before it got interesting. So then they had to try and re-engage them later on. But by that time they're saying, no, it's not really working in there. So if they'd actually engage them in a better way up front and say, look, you may not need to sit through all these long meetings, or what is your expectation, an hour a month, okay, then come in at the end of the meeting and we'll just give you a quick recap. So actually outlining some of that up front and understanding those expectations can help a lot in the process.
We have actually come to 2 o'clock as well.
There we go.
So,
That's handy.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. Much appreciated.
Not a problem at all.
For a recap, is the video going to be available online?
Yes, it will be online as well, so you can see the slides.
We'll send it to colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you.